Hello, and welcome. The day is drawing to a close, and it is time to let the busy world fall away. Find a place of comfort, and allow yourself to settle. Tonight, our journey takes us to a time and a place that can feel both deeply familiar and impossibly distant. For 110 years, it has been home to a deep and sorrowful mystery. It is a story about the violation of a sanctuary, about a single night of unexplained. Its lifeblood was the railroad, which connected its farmers and merchants to the wider world. Josiah Bien Mua, known to most as Joe, was a prominent and successful businessman, an energetic and well-respected figure in the town. He lived with his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children in a modest but comfortable white-painted house on East 2nd Street. There was Herman, age 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and little Paul, just 5 years old. By all accounts, they were a happy, church-going family, the very picture of the Midwestern ideal. Life here was structured and predictable. The week was organized around work, school, and fellowship, with Sunday as its focal point, a day for worship and for rest. She tried to open the door, but found it locked from the inside. He was met with a profound and terrible stillness. He called out, but only silence answered. Something had happened at the Moore house. The town marshal arrived, and as he stepped across the threshold, the innocence of Villisca, Iowa, was extinguished forever. The small white house on the quiet street had become the center of an American nightmare. He moved down the short hallway and opened the door to the downstairs guest bedroom. There was no yellow police tape, no strict protocols. Imagine them, trying to piece together a story from a book whose pages had been smudged and torn by 100 different hands. As they moved methodically through the house, a picture of the crime began to emerge, and it was one of meticulous brutality and profound strangeness. The town marshal, overwhelmed and out of his depth, was unable to control the growing crowd, but it was the details that were so unsettling. After the acts of violence were committed, the killer had moved through the house with a quiet, deliberate purpose. It had been wiped down, though not perfectly. A faint, dark residue still visible. A plate of uneaten food sat on the kitchen table. The killer, it seemed, had taken his time. The doors to the house had been locked from the inside. He had moved through the house with a chilling intimacy, and then, after completing his terrible work, he had simply locked the door behind him and vanished into the morning light. And next to it, on the floor, was perhaps the most inexplicable clue of all, a 2-pound slab of raw bacon, taken from the family's icebox. They had a scene of unimaginable horror, a series of deeply strange, almost symbolic clues, and a crime scene so thoroughly contaminated that it offered up almost no physical evidence. The town of Villisca was locked in a state of terror, looking at their neighbors with a new and terrible suspicion. A killer had walked among them, had entered a home and destroyed a family, and had then disappeared, leaving behind only silence and a set of questions that would haunt the state of Iowa for 100 years to come. It was wrapped in a dish towel and placed there, next to the axe, an utterly nonsensical gesture that defied all logic. Dozens, and by some accounts hundreds, of townspeople were allowed to traipse through the house. They walked through the rooms in a long, somber procession, touching walls, handling objects, their shoes destroying any potential footprints, their presence erasing any chance of finding reliable physical evidence. Every mirror in the house, every pane of glass that could cast a reflection, had also been covered with a cloth. Was it superstition? Remorse? It was a strange, symbolic act that baffled the investigators, or part of some unknown private ceremony. They came to see the horror for themselves, and in doing so, they inadvertently destroyed the very clues that might have identified the person responsible. By the time more experienced law enforcement arrived from neighboring counties, the scene was hopelessly contaminated. He was a small-town peacekeeper, a man accustomed to dealing with minor disputes and the occasional public intoxication. Nothing in his experience could have prepared him for what lay inside that house. He walked through the rooms, confirming the terrible truth. 8 people, including 6 children, had met a violent end in their sleep. The Stillinger girls in the downstairs bedroom, Joe and Sarah in their upstairs room, and the 4 Moore children in theirs each had been draped with a sheet or a piece of clothing, as if the killer could not bear to look upon what he had done. In the dim light, he could make out 2 forms in the bed, and dark stains on the pillowcases. Still, nothing. Not yet comprehending the full horror, but knowing something was deeply wrong, he backed out of the room, hurried back onto the porch, and told Mary Peckham. Yet the marshal, after calling her brother, she also telephoned Joe Moore's brother, Ross. Ross Moore arrived shortly after, his own sense of unease growing. He knocked, he shouted, he walked around the house, peering into windows. The initial shock quickly gave way to a morbid, horrified curiosity. A crowd gathered on the street outside the small white house, their numbers swelling throughout the morning. And here, in these first few hours, a critical and irreversible mistake was made, a mistake that would cripple the investigation for the next century. Sarah Moore, a dedicated member of the congregation, had organized the annual Children's Day celebration, and Ina Stillinger, aged 12 and 8, were invited to walk home with the family and stay the night. It was a simple, innocent invitation, the kind made thousands of times in small towns, a small act of friendship that would, by morning, become an unbearable tragedy. The shades were still drawn. The house seemed to be holding its breath. Imagine the scene, the small church filled with families in their Sunday best. They are thick with the scent of polished wood and old hymn books. But next door, the Moore's neighbor, a woman named Mary Peckham, noticed an unusual stillness. By Anne, the Moore house was usually bustling with the sounds of children preparing for their day. But this morning, there was only silence. The children, including the Moore children, would have recited verses, sung psalms, and performed in little plays they had rehearsed for weeks. Lights would have been lit, preparations made for bed. It was the kind of wholesome community event that defined life in towns like Villisca. It was a community where everyone knew everyone else, where family histories were intertwined like the roots of the old oak trees that lined its streets, and brutal violence that visited a family in their beds, and about the long, dark shadow it cast over a community. They would have spoken of the evening's successes, the children likely still buzzing with excitement. They arrived at their home around PM, and then, one by one, the lights in the White House on East 2nd Street went out. We travel back to the American heartland, to the summer of 1912. Imagine a world lit by gas lamps, a world whose rhythm was set by the passing of the steam train and the ringing of the church bell. Let the noise of the modern world fade, and let us step back into the light. A world of small towns where doors were often left unlocked, and life moved with the slow, predictable certainty of the seasons. It was a world built on a foundation of simple faith and the belief that safety was found in community, and that evil was something that happened far away, in other, bigger places. Our story tonight is set in one such town, a place called Villisca, Iowa. This is not a story for thrills, but for quiet contemplation on the fragility of peace. So, take a soft, slow breath. Let us visit the town of Villisca on a warm Sunday in June, a day of sunshine and simple joys, unaware that it was the last day of its innocence. In the year 1912, Villisca, Iowa, was a small but prosperous town, a proud hub in the agricultural belt of the American Midwest. At the heart of this community lived the Moore family. Our story finds its center on Sunday, June 9th. It was a special day at Villisca's Presbyterian Church. After the evening program concluded, two young friends of the Moore children, Lena, the group Joe, Sarah, their 4 children, and the 2 Stillinger girls walked home together under the Iowa night sky. The streets were quiet. The next morning, Monday, June 10th, the sun rose on a perfectly normal day. Concerned, Mrs. Peckham went to the front porch and knocked. There was no answer. Using his own set of keys, he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The word began to spread like a phantom through the quiet morning streets of Villisca. The man who first stepped officially into the quiet horror of the Moore house was the town marshal, Hank Horton. Word of the tragedy spread through Villisca with the speed of a prairie fire. In 1912, the concept of a secured crime scene was in its infancy. It was into this chaotic environment that the true investigators had to work. Every victim had been killed in their own bed with what was determined to be a single heavy weapon, an axe belonging to Joe Moore, which the killer had found in the backyard. In every room where a victim lay, their face had been covered, and there were other, even more bizarre, ritualistic touches. In the downstairs bedroom where the 2 Stillinger girls lay, the murder weapon was found. The axe was leaned neatly against the wall. The investigators also found a bowl of bloody water in the kitchen, suggesting the killer had washed his hands before leaving. So, as the first day of the investigation drew to a close, the authorities were left with a nightmarish puzzle. They had a scene of unimaginable horror, a series of deeply strange, almost symbolic clues, and a crime scene so thoroughly contaminated that it offered up almost no physical evidence. The town of Villisca was locked in a state of terror, looking at their neighbors with a new and terrible suspicion. With the crime scene offering no clear answers, The investigation turned away from the silent house and towards the living. With no physical evidence to guide them, the detectives were forced to hunt for a motive. This search for a reason, for a story that made sense of the senseless, would soon tear the once tight-knit community apart. Reverend George Kelly was an English-born travelling preacher, known for his eccentric and sometimes unsettling demeanour. He was a small man with a high-pitched voice, and by his own admission, had suffered from mental health issues in his youth. Some investigators, including Wilkerson, began to notice a terrifying pattern. The Villisca murders were not unique. They bore a chilling resemblance to a series of other unsolved family murders that had taken place in other Midwestern towns in the preceding years. They were the work of a transient serial killer, a faceless phantom who travelled the railway stepping of the train in a quiet, unsuspecting town, or wandering methodical monster with no connection to the town at all. Each theory had its champions. Each had its flaws. The prosecution built its case almost entirely on Kelly's strange confession, which he had long since recanted. The defense, in turn, painted him as a mentally vulnerable man, coerced by aggressive investigators into confessing to a crime he did not commit. The evidence was thin, the testimony contradictory. The trial ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, a hung jury, unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The horror of that June night did not end when the killer locked the door to the Moore house. It simply escaped and seeped into the very soul of the town. Villisca had suffered a second death, the death of its own community spirit. The small, white home on East 2nd Street still stands. It has been preserved, looking much as it did on that night in 1912. It is no longer a family home. The true horror of Villisca is the lack of resolution, a mystery that has become a permanent scar on the American landscape. There is only rest, but a dark museum, a silent witness to an unspeakable horror. You can let the shadows of the past recede, and find your own peace in the quiet comfort of the present. There is nothing more to solve, nothing more to understand. It has gained a reputation as one of the most haunted places in America, visited by paranormal investigators and those drawn to its sorrowful history. Perhaps it is not spirits that haunt the house, but the sheer weight of the unanswered question that hangs within its walls. A second trial was held shortly after, and this time, the jury was decisive. Modern researchers, looking at the evidence with fresh eyes, have often leaned towards the theory of a transient serial killer. The parallels to other, similar slayings along the railroad lines are simply too strong for many to ignore. It suggests a killer who was a phantom in every sense, a man without a local motive, because he had no local life, a man who brought his darkness with him on the train and took it away just as quietly. But without new evidence, it remains, like all the others, just a theory. After just 2 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict of not guilty. The community of Villisca, once united in its simple faith, was now hopelessly divided. An orderly, predictable world was visited by an act of absolute chaos, and the question of why was never answered. A killer or killers stepped out of the darkness, extinguished 8 lives, and then stepped back into the darkness, leaving a community forever broken by the search for a phantom. And the truth of what happened in the little white house on that June night seemed further away than ever. Committing his terrible act while the town slept, and then catching the next train out before the sun rose, vanishing back into the vastness of the American landscape. But that moment would never truly arrive. Of the many suspects and theories, only one man ever faced a jury: the eccentric travelling preacher, Reverend George Kelly. Reverend Kelly had been a guest preacher at the Children's Day service on the night of the murders. The state of Iowa never charged another person with the crime. The case was, for all official purposes, over. The investigation fractured, following 3 main and entirely different paths. With the courts providing no answers, the court of public opinion took over. The community, once bound by trust, fractured into bitter factions. There were those who believed firmly in the guilt of Frank F. Jones, seeing him as a powerful man who had used his influence to escape justice. There were others who defended Jones fiercely, viewing him as the victim of a malicious smear campaign by an obsessed detective. Still others believed Reverend Kelly, despite his acquittal, was the man responsible. Fellow passengers on that train would later claim that he seemed agitated and that he spoke of the murders before the news could have possibly reached him. Most damning of all, years later, while in custody for another offense, Reverend Kelly confessed to the Villisca murders in stunning detail. But then, just as quickly, he recanted, claiming his confession had been coerced by police who preyed on his fragile mental state. He was a man who confessed to the crime, yet whose guilt remained deeply uncertain. A killer had walked among them, had entered a home and destroyed a family, and had then disappeared, leaving behind only silence and a set of questions that would haunt the state of Iowa for 100 years to come. In these other cases too, the killer had often covered the victims' faces and the mirrors in the house. A lamp was often taken from a room and placed at the foot of the bed, its chimney removed, and crucially, all of these towns lay along the main railway lines. While there was no direct evidence to support this, the motive of business and personal revenge was a powerful one. It was a story that made a certain kind of sense to many in Villisca. The idea that a dark secret lay behind the respectable facade of the town's elite. In the days and weeks that followed the murders, the town of Villisca was a community consumed by fear and suspicion. The first path led directly to the most powerful man in town, State Senator Frank F. Jones. On the surface, Jones was an unlikely suspect. He was a respected elder statesman and a wealthy, influential businessman. But beneath the surface, there was a deep and bitter rivalry with the victim, Josiah Moore. For many years, Joe Moore had been Jones's top employee at his farm implement business. But Moore had eventually left to start his own competing company, and he was very successful, taking a significant portion of Jones's business. In a small town, this was a major source of tension. There were also persistent, though unproven, rumors that Joe Moore had been having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. The theory, pursued with relentless obsession by a private detective named James Wilkerson, was that Frank Jones, a proud man who did not suffer rivals lightly, had hired an assassin to eliminate the Moore family. The second path of the investigation led to a very different kind of suspect. Suspicion fell on him for several reasons. He had left Villisca on a train at 5 o'clock on the morning the bodies were discovered. The third path of the investigation looked beyond the borders of Villisca, beyond local rivalries and personalities. In Colorado Springs, Colorado, in Ellsworth, Kansas, in Monmouth, Illinois, other families had been killed in their beds with the blunt side of an axe. This led to the third and perhaps most terrifying theory of all, that the Villisca murders were not the work of a local man with a local grudge. So, the investigation was torn. Was the killer a powerful local man trying to settle a score? A mentally disturbed preacher with a dark secret? In the years that followed the Villisca murders, the town waited for a confrontation, for a moment of justice that might bring closure and allow the healing to begin. Families were torn apart by accusation and rumor. His trial, held in 1917, 5 years after the murders, was a sensation. And with that, the legal road to justice for the Moore and Stillinger families came to a dead end. But for the town of Villisca, the tragedy was just entering a new, more insidious phase. This cloud of suspicion poisoned the town for a generation. Friendships that had lasted a lifetime were broken. Business partnerships dissolved. Over the century that followed, the Villisca Axe Murders became one of America's most infamous and studied cold cases. The story is over. You can let the mystery fade into the background. The most tangible legacy of the crime is the house itself. The story of the Villisca Axe Murders is terrifying not simply because of the act itself, but because of the silence that followed. It is a story about the human need for answers, and the profound unease that settles in when none can be found. But unlike the town of Villisca, you are not asked to live with this unanswered question. Sleep now. Good night.